Saint Augustine on the Most Holy Trinity, Book 14, Chapter 5 and following. Chapter 5, Whether the Mind of Infants Knows Itself. What then is to be said of the mind of an infant, which is still so small and buried in such profound ignorance of things, that the mind of a man which knows anything shrinks from the darkness of it? Is that too to be believed to know itself, but that as being too intent upon those things which it has begun to perceive through the bodily senses, with a greater delight in proportion to their novelty, it is not able indeed to be ignorant of itself, but is also not able to think of itself? Moreover, how intently it is bent upon sensible things that are without it, may be conjectured from this one fact, that it is so greedy of sensible light, that if anyone through carelessness or ignorance of the possible consequences place a light at night time where an infant is lying down, on that side to which the eyes of the child so lying down can be bent, but its neck can't be turned, the gaze of that child will be so fixed in that direction that we have known some to have come to squint by this means, in that the eyes retained that form which habit in some way impressed upon them while tender and soft. In the case too of the other bodily senses, the souls of infants, as far as their age permits, so narrow themselves as it were, and are bent upon them, that they either vehemently detest or vehemently desire that only which offends or allures through the flesh, but do not think of their own inward self, nor can be made to do so by admonition, because they do not yet know the signs that express admonition, whereof words are the chief, of which as of other things they are wholly ignorant. And that it is one thing not to know oneself, another not to think of oneself, we have shown already in the same book. But let us pass by the infantine age, since we can't question it as to what goes on within itself, while we have ourselves pretty well forgotten it. Let it suffice only for us hence to be certain that, when man has come to be able to think of the nature of his own mind, and to find out what is the truth, he will find it nowhere else but in himself. And he will find not what he did not know, but that of which he did not think. For what do we know if we do not know what is in our own mind, when we can know nothing at all of what we do know, unless by the mind? Chapter 6, How a kind of Trinity exists in the mind thinking of itself. What is a part of the thought in this Trinity? The function of thought, however, is so great that not even the mind itself can, so to say, place itself in its own sight, except when it thinks of itself, and hence it is so far the case that nothing is in the sight of the mind except that which is being thought of, that not even the mind itself, whereby we think whatever we do think, can be in its own sight otherwise than by thinking of itself. But in what way it is not in its own sight when it is not thinking of itself, while it can never be without itself, as though itself were one thing, and the sight of itself another? it is not in my power to discover. For this is not unreasonably said of the eye of the body. For the eye itself of the body is fixed in its own proper place in the body, but its sight extends to things external to itself, and reaches even to the stars. And the eye is not in its own sight, since it does not look at itself, unless by means of a mirror, as is said above. A thing that certainly does not happen when the mind places itself in its own sight by thinking of itself. Does it then see one part of itself by means of another part of itself, when it looks at itself in thought, as we look at some of our members, which can be in our sight, with other also of our members, viz. With our eyes? What can be said or thought more absurd? For by what is the mind removed except by itself? Or where is it placed so as to be in its own sight except before itself? Therefore, it will not be there where it was when it was not in its own sight, because it has been put down in one place after being taken away from another. But if it migrated in order to be beheld, where will it remain in order to behold? Is it as it were doubled, so as to be in this and in that place at the same time, viz., both where it can behold and where it can be beheld, that in itself it may be beholding, and before itself beheld? If we ask the truth, it will tell us nothing of the sort, since it is but faint images of bodily objects, of which we conceive when we conceive thus, and that the mind is not such is very certain to the few minds by which the truth on such a subject can be inquired. It appears, therefore, that the beholding of the mind is something pertaining to its nature, and is recalled to that nature when it conceives of itself, not as if by moving through space, but by an incorporeal conversion, and when it is not conceiving of itself. It appears that it is not indeed in its own sight, nor is its own perception formed from it, but yet that it knows itself as though it were to itself a remembrance of itself. Like one who is skilled in many branches of learning, the things which he knows are contained in his memory, but nothing thereof is in the sight of his mind, except that of which he is conceiving, while all the rest are stored up in a kind of secret knowledge, which is called memory. The Trinity, then, which we were setting forth, was constituted in this way. First, we placed in the memory the object by which the perception of the percipient was formed, next the conformation, or, as it were, the image which is impressed thereby. Lastly, love, or will, as that which combines the two. When the mind, then, beholds itself in conception, it understands and cognizes itself. It begets, therefore, this its own understanding and cognition. For an incorporeal thing is understood when it is beheld, and is cognized when understood. Yet certainly the mind does not so beget this knowledge of itself when it beholds itself as understood by conception, as though it had before been unknown to itself. But it was known to itself in the way in which things are known which are contained in the memory, but of which one is not thinking. Since we say that a man knows letters even when he is thinking of something else and not of letters. And these two, the begetter and the begotten, are coupled together by love, as by a third, which is nothing else than will, seeking or holding fast the enjoyment of something. We held, therefore, that the Trinity of the mind is to be intimated also by these three terms: memory, intelligence, will. But since the mind, as we said near the end of the same 10th book, always remembers itself and always understands and loves itself, although it does not always think of itself as distinguished from those things which are not itself, we must inquire in what way understanding belongs to conception, while the notion of each thing that is in the mind, even when one is not thinking of it, is said to belong only to the memory. For if this is so, then the mind had not these three things, viz., the remembrance, the understanding, and the love of itself, but it only remembered itself, and afterwards, when it began to think of itself, then it understood and loved itself. Chapter 7, the thing is made plain by an example, in what way the matter is handled in order to help the reader. Wherefore, let us consider more carefully that example which we have adduced, wherein it was shown that not knowing a thing is different from not thinking, conceiving of it, and that it may so happen that a man knows something of which he is not thinking, when he is thinking of something else, not of that. When anyone then who is skilled in two or more branches of knowledge is thinking of one of them, though he is not thinking of the other or others, yet he knows them. But can we say rightly, this musician certainly knows music, but he does not now understand it, because he is not thinking of it. But he does now understand geometry, for of that he is now thinking. Such an assertion, as far as appears, is absurd. What again if we were to say, this musician certainly knows music, but he does not now love it, while he is not now thinking of it, but he does now love geometry, because of that he is now thinking. Is not this similarly absurd? But we say quite correctly, this person whom you perceive disputing about geometry is also a perfect musician, for he both remembers music and understands and loves it, but although he both knows and loves it, he is not now thinking of it, since he is thinking of geometry of which he is disputing. And hence we are warned that we have a kind of knowledge of certain things stored up in the recesses of the mind, and that this, when it is thought of as if it were, steps forth in public, and is placed as if openly in the sight of the mind, for then the mind itself finds that it both remembers and understands and loves itself, even although it was not thinking of itself, when it was thinking of something else. But in the case of that of which we have not thought of for a long time, and can think of it unless reminded, that if the phrase is allowable in some wonderful way, I know not how, we do not know that we know. In short, it is rightly said by him who reminds to him whom he reminds, you know this, but you do not know that you know it. I will remind you, and you will find that you know what you had thought you did not know. Books too lead to the same results, viz., those that are written upon subjects which the reader under the guidance of reason finds to be true, not those subjects which he believes to be true on the faith of the narrator, as in the case of history, but those which he himself also finds to be true, either of himself or in that truth itself which is the light of the mind. But he who can contemplate these things even when reminded is too deeply buried in the darkness of ignorance, through great blindness of heart, and too wonderfully needs divine help to be able to attain the true wisdom. For this reason I have wished to adduce some kind of proof, be it what it might, respecting the act of conceiving, such as might serve to show in what way, out of the things contained in the memory, the mind's eyes is informed in recollecting, and such thing is begotten when a man conceives, as was already in him, when before he conceived he remembered, because it is easier to distinguish things that take place at successive times and where the parent precedes the offspring by an interval of time. 4. If we refer ourselves to the inner memory of the mind by which it remembers itself, and to the inner understanding by which it understands itself, and to the inner will by which it loves itself, where these three always are together and always have been together since they began to be at all, whether they were being thought of or not, the image of this Trinity will indeed appear to pertain even to the memory alone. But because in this case a word can be without a thought, for we think all that we say, even if it be said by that inner word which belongs to no separate language, this image is rather to be discerned in these three things, viz., memory, intelligence, will. And I mean now by intelligence that by which we understand in thought, that is, when our thought is formed by the finding of those things which had been at hand to the memory, but were not being thought of, and I mean that will or love, or preference which combines this offspring and parent, and is in some way common to both. Hence it was that I tried also, viz. In the 11th book, to lead on the slowness of readers by means of outward sensible things, which are seen by the eyes of the flesh, and that I then proceeded to enter with them upon that power of the inner man, whereby he reasons of things temporal, deferring the consideration of that which dominates as the higher power, by which he contemplates things eternal. And I discussed this in 2 books, distinguishing the two in the 12th, the one of them being higher and the other lower, and that the lower ought to be subject to the higher. And in the 13th I discussed with what truth and brevity I could the office of the lower, in which the wholesome knowledge of things human is contained, in order that we may so act in this temporal life as to attain that which is eternal. Since indeed I have cursorily included in a single book a subject so manifold and copious, and one so well known by the many and great arguments of many and great men, while manifesting that a Trinity exists also in it, but not yet one that can be called an image of God. Chapter 8. The Trinity, which is the image of God, is now to be sought in the noblest part of the mind. But we have come now to that argument in which we have undertaken to consider the noblest part of the human mind, by which it knows or can know God, in order that we may find in it the image of God. For although the human mind is not of the same nature with God, yet the image of that nature, than which known is better, is to be sought and found in us, in that than which our nature also has nothing better. But the mind must first be considered as it is in itself, before it becomes partaker of God, and his image must be found in it, For as we have said, although worn out and defaced by losing the participation of God, yet the image of God still remains. For it is his image in this very point that it is capable of him and can be partaker of him, which so great good is only made possible by its being his image. Well then, the mind remembers, understands, loves itself. If we discern this, we discern a Trinity, not yet indeed God, but now at last an image of God. The memory does not receive from without that which it is to hold, nor does the understanding find without that which it is to regard, as the eye of the body does, nor has will joined these two forms without, as it joins the form of the bodily object, and that which is thence wrought in the vision of the beholder. Nor has conception, in being turned to it, found an image of a thing seen without, which has been somehow seized and laid up in the memory, whence the intuition of him that recollects has been formed, will as a third joining the two, as we showed to take place in those trinities which were discovered in things corporeal, or which were somehow drawn within from bodily objects by the bodily sense, of all which we have discoursed in the 11th book. Nor again as it took place or appeared to do so, when we went on further to discuss that knowledge which had its place now in the workings of the inner man, and which was to be distinguished from wisdom, of which knowledge the subject part was as it were adventitious to the mind, and either was brought thither by historical information, as deeds and words which are performed in time and pass away, or which again are established in the nature of things in their own times and places, or arises in the man himself not being there before, whether on the information of others or by his own thinking, as faith, which we commended at length in the 13th book, or as the virtues by which, if they are true, one so lives well in this mortality as to live blessedly in that immortality which God promises. These and other things of the kind have their proper order in time, and in that order we discern more easily a trinity of memory, sight, and love. For some of such things anticipate the knowledge of learners, for they are knowable also before they are known, and beget in the learner a knowledge of themselves, and they either exist in their own proper places, or have happened in time past, or the things that are past do not themselves exist, but only certain signs of them as past, the sight of hearing of which makes it known that they have been and have passed away. And these signs are either situate in the places themselves, as e.g. monuments of the dead or the like, or exist in written books worthy of credit, as is all history that is of weight and approved authority, or are in the minds of those who already know them, since what is already known to them is knowable certainly to others also, whose knowledge it has anticipated, and who are able to know it on the information of those who do know it. And all these things, when they are learned, produce a certain kind of trinity, viz. By their own proper species, which was knowable also before it was known, and by the application of this of the knowledge of the learner, which then begins to exist when he learns them, and by will as a third which combines both. And when they are known, yet another trinity is produced in the recollecting of them, and this now inwardly in the mind itself, from those images which, when they were learnt, were impressed upon the memory, and from the informing of the thought, when the look has been turned upon these by recollection, and from the will, which as a third combines these two. But those things which arise in the mind not having been there before, as faith and other things of that kind, although they appear to be adventitious, since they are implanted by teaching, yet are not situated without or transacted without, as are those things which are believed, but began to be altogether within the mind itself. For faith is not that which is believed, but that by which it is believed, and the former is believed, the latter seen. Nevertheless, because it began to be in the mind, which was the mind also before these things began to be in it, it seems to be somewhat adventitious, and will be reckoned among things past, when sight shall have succeeded, and itself shall have ceased to be. And it makes now by its presence, retained as it is and beheld and loved, a different Trinity from that which it will then make by means of some trace of itself, which in passing it will have left in the memory, as has been already said above.